asked sort of in not super formally if we wanted to do a workshop about the history of Houston, and we are 3 people who are interested in the history of Houston, and I know a lot of other people in this room are, interested and probably know stuff about history of Houston that we don't. But we made a list of stuff that would take probably like 3 hours to talk about.
At least.
So we don't want to do that. So we were interested if anybody had ideas of specific things they'd like to talk about, or that we may or may not be able to share things about it. So I saw a hand. Yes.
I would be interested specifically talking about like the history of Klan stuff here and the John Brown Revolutionary. I can't find anything
that's on our list.
Yeah.
So.
All right.
I was in John Brown, and I wrote a story about it, so we can talk about that. And
over here.
I would like to hear a brief history of Second Ward and the Latino neighborhoods here, and how far back they go.
okay,
That's kind of sort of on our list, but not. We can
touch
touch the surface maybe.
yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of East Side history. We've talked about that.
Anybody else? Anybody else?
I'm interested in learning more about gentrification in the city and how the neighborhoods have shifted over time, what the different factors are in that, especially since things have been, seem like they've been changing so much so quickly lately.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that touches on Allen Parkway Village, and I mean, the whole history of development and redevelopment and redevelopment. I mean, this whole, things have been developed about 3 times as far as downtown has shifted. It was here, and then it was there, and there's a lot of, that's a lot of stuff.
Anything else? Anybody knows a history story that's really cool about Houston that they want to tell us?
Like UH.
So what?
Riot at UH. That's just.
Riot where? Which one?
At UH.
Riot at U of H.
I know Ralph.
Over African American Studies?
Yeah.
Yeah, I know Ralph was there, but Esther talked about that.
Okay, so I don't know the best we got. And we've got some stories that we want to tell too. But so the Klan, Second Ward, gentrification, struggle at UH. How do we want to do it? Who wants to go first?
Start on that list and then we can go from there.
Okay. Do you want to talk about the Klan for 5 minutes?
Yeah, and like the Klan, I mean, it's hard to even know where to start because there's so. I mean, this whole region is dominated by the Klan politically and economically, and they had demands and everything. I mean, since Reconstruction, the Klan was, almost one and the same. The Baptists, the Democrats, and the KKK. I mean, they're the same people, for the most part. This whole east side of Houston made, when it was built, to support the ship channel by Mexican immigrant labor coming from Monterey and El Paso. It pretty much integrated Hispanic people, Mexican people, into the Houston mix, which previous to 1900, because of the hurricane in Galveston, they could build the ship channel. Previous to that, there was no Hispanic population. But because they had to build this, they brought those laborers in, it integrated this part of Houston, and the timber that was used to build this whole side of Houston came from East Texas, from lands that had previously been owned by African Americans, given to them as part of the 40 acres and a mule after the Civil War. And when that Galveston hurricane happened, and just, made Galveston not an option anymore for a big port, they built this thing here. The whole east side of Houston is all about the ship channel, right? All of a sudden, that timber in East Texas on those African American lands became extremely valuable. And then the Klan moved in to take the land away. And they did their typical Klan stuff, terrorism, to get people off their land and to take the land. And because the whole culture was lined up with the Klan, the Democratic Party, the Baptists, it was all one big kind of family. they snagged that African-American land, pretty hastily. And it happened to coincide with a railroad that went from New Orleans to Houston. It's a symbol of the city, right? The little railroad. Okay. And it came from around Vidor, which is still headquarters of the Klan in Texas. And the Klan, I guess you'd call the high up in the Klan, the oligarchy, the leaders, the people that are still in power in Vidor, got very wealthy off that timber because it built this whole east side of Houston. And what's kind of poignant is that at the same time the Klan took stuff away from the African Americans to be able to build this side of Houston, it in effect, brought a huge ethnic population to Houston, which is pretty much antithetical to the whole Klan vision of things, right? So you see the whole yin-yang, two sides of the coin thing going on there. That's one level of Klan activity. That's 1900 to 1910, building the ship channel. And then let's do something else and talk about John Brown later, because that's, John Brown is a shift in history up to, the 1970s, 1980s. So a whole bunch of stuff happened in between there. We'll probably talk about the 1960s and things first.
Yeah, I would just say, I think when we talk about John Brown Revolutionary League, understand that there were two. There was the first John Brown Revolutionary League that was active around People's Party 2 and acted in solidarity with that.
First of all, does anybody here need to know who John Brown was historically? Does anybody know where that name comes from or why? Maybe we should talk about John Brown for a second.
But just kind of real quick, and then we can go back. So then I think that later on was the organization John Brown Anti-Klan movement that you were involved with. So I think that there were two different organizations. So I'm not sure which, I guess which one you had in mind. And so go ahead. Or you want to explain.
Well, just John Brown was an abolitionist, a radical abolitionist, who, him and his son Eusan, these guys really had some fire in them, and their idea was to go and arm the slaves, have a slave rebellion. And so they were going up against some U.S. military facilities that had guns, where they stored guns, warehouses of guns. And the idea was to take these guns and form a slave army, and then fight slavery that way. And they were all caught and hung. But when the Civil War happened, the same army that John Brown was going up against, the U.S. military, when they marched on the South, they were singing songs about how John Brown was a hero because he was a radical abolitionist. It's kind of like a big FU kind of a song to the Southern soldiers. And you're familiar with the song. I could whistle it for you, but I'll skip that. It's a popular song. Anyway, that's who he was historically. And so other people that have been fighting the Klan have taken on his name as kind of connect themselves to that abolition thing.
Like a militia.
Pardon?
Like a militia.
He had a militia. It's like maybe a dozen or 2 dozen people that were.
But they were just like slaves or what?
No, it was white guys that were abolitionists that were against slavery, and so they had a militia that went up against some garrison, some armament.
Harper's Ferry, yeah, but they were white abolitionists that moved to Kansas, and Kansas was a contested territory between slave owning and pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces, and their goal was to. This happened before the Civil War. This was really led to the Civil War happening, but their goal was to end slavery by, military action, and yeah.
I think the point that you brought up about, I think historically through the years, a lot of anti-racist organizations, predominantly white, have taken that name in some form or another. But I guess to answer your specific question about JBRL, was an offshoot of a faction that came out of SDS. And and I think a lot of it is important to go back and at least stuff after the 60s, look at how a lot of this stuff kind of evolved out of SDS and what they gave rise to, one faction or another. But the John Brown folks that were here and stood with People's Party 2 came out of the Revolutionary Youth Movement wing of SDS. And all of these national events have an implications to what happened here in Houston. Various factions deciding what they were going to do, where they were going to line up. And it was kind of at that point that folks organized a local branch of the John Brown Revolutionary League in the early 70s. And it was out of that they built a very strong revolutionary alliance and solidarity with People's Party 2, along with Mayo. And I think sometimes we were talking earlier that aspect is a little, everyone knows about Dowling and Hampton and that assassination, but what I think is lost.
Does everyone know about that?
I think people don't know
Are there
what
people here that aren't
SDS
from Houston?
Yeah.
Okay, so
Okay, so we'll take it a little bit slower, but during a struggle, I guess my point to that is that the John Brown Revolutionary League was able to form a very revolutionary alliance with People's Party 2. The night
which was the name of Houston's Black Panther Party, which
Yes.
is a long story, but we could go into that.
Yeah, and they pretty much were the white guys in this armed struggle. Prior to the day of that attack, there was also Mayo folks that were involved in the arms defense of People's Party 2. For a number of reasons, the Mayo folks had to leave, and the JBRL only had 2 people at People's Party 2 the day of the attack, and one was wounded. The other was managed to escape and take the wounded guy, get him to the hospital with a lawyer. And I think that kind of armed solidarity was a very strong point to that whole period and that struggle. That there were other folks there that were armed as well that would defend and help People's Party to defend their headquarters. You got the attack.
So, should we tell the story of what the background of? So there was okay.
Can I?
So people don't. Yeah. Can I backtrack just a tiny
now we
bit?
can back
Okay.
up.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
With this story, People's Party 2 was the Black Panther Party chapter in Houston. It was at a period of time where nationally the Black Panther Party was expanding really rapidly. Folks know about the Black Panther Party, right? Okay, great. So in Houston, there were people that were inspired by that and wanted to start a chapter, and at the time they weren't allowing new chapters to join. So a young guy, Carl Hampton, who grew up in the Pleasantville neighborhood in East Houston, said, well, we're going to call it People's Party 2 because Black Panther Party is the first People's Party. So it was, they did the same thing. They sold the Black Panther newspaper, and they organized, they started in 3rd Ward, which is the neighborhood just that way, and organized around a lot of different issues related to like what poor African Americans were facing. So like fighting against landlords, like they had a free breakfast program. They had a free pest eradication where they would like spray for roaches and like did other programs to serve the people in the neighborhood. And for whatever reason, that's extremely threatening to the existing power structure, and it led to a situation where somebody, like a teenager kid who was selling newspapers on the street, was being hassled by police. Carl Hampton, who was the leader of the People's Party 2, showed up, and guns were drawn, and it led to this like 2-3 week standoff at their headquarters, which is on Dowling Street, and it ended with a shootout where police snipers on the roof of a church shot and killed this 21-year-old leader of the Black Panthers in Houston. And so what John was talking about is that the work that they were doing was they weren't alone. There was the John Brown Revolutionary League, which was white people who were wanted to see revolutionary changes, and also the Mexican American Youth Organization, which were Chicano Mexican American folks in Houston that were working together on really wanting to see a radical transformation of Houston.
What year was this?
This was 1970, June 26th.
I think, you know, for me, July 26th, and, you know, I think when you look back at radical history, you have to look at a lot of it in the context of what's going on. And I think that one of the, I guess the really great things that came out of that struggle was that solidarity, that folks realized that armed resistance at that point was the right thing to do. The Chicano moratorium was in the process of organizing itself, and there was an event that day, and that was the only reason that armed Mayo folks were not there, because Carl had basically said, look, we know you got to deal with stuff in your community, you guys take the day off, go do what you got to do. And there was an event earlier that day in the Latino community, not far from here. And so that's why it happened that there were no people from Mayo there that day. Carl, I think, talks about it in a speech at some point, that they had intel that something was going to happen Tuesday, not this Sunday. And so they were a little surprised that it happened Tuesday. In fact, that's why some of the people, more people from the JBRL were not there. If that attack had happened maybe Monday, it would have been a real battle, because you probably would have had Chicanos and white folks, you know.
And it wasn't all that battle anyway, because there
Well,
were
but
people
you know,
in
that's
the
true.
apartments that, there were people that were not part of the Panthers that also were shooting at the
Yeah.
police department.
So,
Let's see. I don't know if we want to do this. This might be out of chronological order, but in terms of Second World history, like there's some interesting stories. Two things I wanted to reference is there's a really good book, like Tori brought up earlier, like Houston is sort of unique in big cities in Texas, and that there was not much of a Hispanic population here. It was basically created by the Allen brothers, who were Yankees, who like marketed the city as being like this wonderful place to come to, and it was like a mosquito-filled swamp.
A place to ship your cotton and sugar cane out. I mean, it's like it was the end of the railroad. So all the plantations along the Gulf Coast, the slave plantations growing sugar cane and cotton, would bring their stuff to the railhead in Houston to ship to the port in New Orleans and by rail.
Yeah, and then related to that, Texas was also, when Texas was an independent country, the United States had signed an international treaty to not import African slaves, but Texas had not signed that, so there were, up until Texas became part of the U.S., they were continuing to buy slaves from Africa. So that was basically, you know, the Texas Revolution was about, you know, Anglo settlers in Texas. They were supposed to learn Spanish, practice Catholicism, not own slaves, and they didn't want to do any of those things. So they founded an independent country where they could do that. So Second Ward, there's about the Mexican American or the Hispanic community in Houston. There's a really, the best book that I'm aware of is a book called Del Pueblo, which is a photo history of the Hispanic community in Houston, and talks about these neighborhoods. And there's a Thomas McWhorter wrote an article in Houston History Magazine about Second Ward that originally the neighborhood was mostly German and other Eastern European immigrants, and it was not until like the early 1900s that it became predominantly Mexican American. That's all I got. Second Ward. I don't know if you wanted to talk about Hugh's tool or.
But just to cap off what you're saying,
Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to point this book out to folks. This is called Ethnicity in the Sun Belt, the history of Mexican Americans in Houston. This is basically the history of the East Side. This, you know, pretty much all happens here on the East Side, a little bit just north, you know, around Magnolia Park, Magnolia Barrio, but mostly it's about the East Side stuff that's going on here, starting with the population moving in to build up around the ship channel, to work at the ship channel. And so it talks a little bit about, you know, it touches, the only other thing I want to mention about this is that, and it just barely touches on the mutual aid societies that were set up here by the immigrants that were, you know, there's a spiritual connection somehow to Eastside Social Center in my mind. These were folks that were immigrants. They had no support. They couldn't really leave the neighborhood here without getting their asses kicked by the Klan folks. And so they first started up the mutual aid societies just to bury people. Because people died, and it's like they couldn't afford burials, and people would chip in just to like get somebody planted, right? And they were typically coming out of some of the First churches, which are still here, Guadalupe, somewhere around here. And so neighborhood associations, people organizing for themselves, because there was nobody else that was around who's going to help them. No social safety nets, and a lot of violence, you know, surrounded them. Okay.
I think one of the, I guess talking about the east side, one of the, I think we're kind of, well, we're probably jumping all over the place, but you know, that's good too, was some of the organizing that was going on by the left. And when Adam first spoke to me about this workshop, my understanding or impression would be that, you know, there is a lot of stuff out there that's probably good academic stuff about various neighborhoods and communities. But that what I kind of wanted to focus on was some of the struggles that went on within those communities. The bolts, the basics, I think a lot of it is out there. But what isn't out there very often is the left and the struggles, the fight back that went on in these communities. And kind of in line with that, you know, back in the early 70s, folks coming out of what was predominantly the youth movement of the 60s, predominantly Marxist-led, you know, started trying to analyze and evaluate, okay, where do we go from here? And how do we put these politics into practice? And that was going on a national level. There were all sorts of organizations that were popping up based in communities of color, based in the Asian community, predominantly white, Marxist-Leninist organization, you know, trying to have discussions where we take the struggle to the next level. And part of that ended up where a lot of folks were going into predominantly, I guess, working class, union shops, industrial facilities. And locally, how all of this came back here, you had, I guess Houston in a lot of ways, movement-wise, was a microcosm of what was going on a national scale. And that's why I think it's important to understand these discussions on a national level. When, because eventually that there were folks here that were trying to put all these ideas into practice. So you had organizations like the Communist Party, Marxist-Leninist, SWP, folks that would become the RCP, Democratic Socialist. There was a Revolutionary Black Workers Association. And everyone was looking, okay, where do we go? How can we immerse ourselves into the working class struggle? And one target was Hugh's Tool Company right over here on the east end on Harrisburg. So for about 2.5 years, there was a very heavy radical influence in that shop. It ran 3 shifts, 7 days a week. But there were probably in the neighborhood of anywhere from 35 to 50 communists of one organization or another. And I guess what was interesting to see how that organizing in that shop took place, that it was not uncommon. Everyone was looking for the advanced workers, you know, on your shift, in your department. And that guy might one day, or woman might one day get a visit from somebody that was in the Progressive Labor Party. 2 days later, the SWP guy was saying, here, read our stuff. And this advanced worker was sitting there, well, wait a minute, you know, I just talked to our co-worker, and he's in this other organization. And the struggles, the theoretical and ideological struggles that were going on outside carried themselves into that plan. And so I think that Hughes Tool Company Shell Refinery was another place where there were probably anywhere from 6 to 10, communists of one sort or another. So if you were a leftist and you wanted to get yourself into one of these positions, Shell or Hughes Tool is where you went. And as a result, most folks ended up leaving. I don't know that there are very many people left that went into the factories during that period. But I think that was an important part of Houston's ideological development, to have all these folks. In fact, one of the black comrades that was in the shop is now a guy who heads up, I think Chester Pitts, he heads up the Black Worker Center in Berkeley. He's a professor, and I think there's a Black Worker Center in Oakland, and he came out of this organizing experience at Hughes Tool.
All right. One thing that Marie asked about with the riot at U of H was the struggle for an African American studies program at the University of Houston. And I don't know how quickly I can do this, but basically U of H was a public university that only served white students. It was segregated until the 1960s, and there had been different types of efforts to integrate the school that had not been successful. But the school actually integrated because the athletics department wanted a better football and basketball team. And
So that coincided with...
Yeah, the
I mean, you
first-
notice how TSU is right next to U of H? It's because it was segregated. I mean,
the first 3 black undergraduate students at the University of Houston were a football player and 2 basketball players. And it's Don Cheney, I can't remember the other.
what year is this?
I want to say they started in like 65 and they were until 69. But that sort of sent a signal to young black people all over the state that like the University of Houston was a university that was interested in having black students, whether or not that was what the message they were trying to send. Black students from across Texas came to U of H, and there was an organization called, it was first called Committee on Better Race Relations, COBRA, and it turned into African Americans for Black Liberation, and was
Able.
or able. And so there were, let's see, one of their first big victories was winning, thanks. Lynn Eusan was elected the homecoming queen at the University of Houston in 1968 and was the first black woman to win homecoming queen at a predominantly white university. And that was sort of put them on the map and won them a lot of support in the black community in Houston. And then in 1969, they put out a list of 10 demands for the school to change, which included like giving students credit for doing work in the community, a minimum wage that was at least $2 for service workers on the university, and a number of other, like creation of an African American Studies program. And it led to a semester-long demonstrations like almost every week, marches on campus, and accumulated with, towards the end of the semester, Jean Locke, who recently ran for mayor but was part of ABLE, was attacked by white students in the parking lot and beat up. And it led to a demonstration that took place where it ended at the student center, and what happened? There was like a door was ripped off the wall into the library, and there was like people almost took like a cash register, and there was just like
destroy the bookstore or something, or
it went into the bookstore, and there was there are after pictures of like a lot of stuff got knocked over and stuff like that, and so that led to the university at first promised they wouldn't allow the students to be prosecuted, that would be handled internally, and then the students were were arrested and prosecuted, but ended up being let off. And this wasn't, as John's saying, like this is happening when a million things are happening at the same time. It was